Hey, so right now we're going to look at writing good dialogue. This is about writing dialogue that's interesting, but also technically accurate. And those two things are important because we don't want to confuse our readers when they're trying to follow who's talking. And we also don't want to bore readers with back and forth dialogue that isn't very interesting or doesn't make a lot of sense or is just repeating information. So those two things, let's dive in. Here we go. Okay, first of all, dialogue must be formatted correctly. The correct format is this: quotation mark, dialogue, punctuation, quotation mark. And you're going to follow that format every time. We need to open with a quote, then we have what they're saying, some sort of punctuation, could be a comma, could be a full stop, exclamation mark, we'll get into that in a second, and then ending with a quotation mark. Here's how it works in different cases. So here's our basic case. Hello. This is our regular formatting. We have a quote, then the dialogue, then a punctuation mark, and then end dialogue. That's just for a standalone line by itself. Down here, if we have what's called a dialogue tag, which is a nice, quick, easy thing that says, he replied, or he said, or she said, etc., then we have a comma into the dialogue tag. A comma essentially acts like a full stop, except we're saying we're also about to tell you who's talking. Notice that always goes inside the quote mark, not outside the quote mark when we're formatting dialogue. And also there's no capital after the comma here, so it's a lowercase he. Question marks and exclamation marks also go inside the quote marks, so any kind of punctuation that you're using is going to be inside it. Now, if we're going into a dialogue tag and then coming out of it, like this line that says, I'm fine, he said, but a little tired, we need a comma in and out of the dialogue tag. So we have one coming into it, I'm fine, he said, and then if the sentence is continuing, then we have another comma after he said, and then we're into the rest of the quote. The comma goes after said, after the word, not inside that first quotation mark. That's important. Now, this is where things get a little tricky. If we're using a dialogue tag, but you're using something like a question mark, then for capitalization purposes, the question mark acts like a comma. So we have why are you tired as a question. We need the question mark there to make sure that we know it's a question. But we're also adding this dialogue tag, she asked. So notice that stays lowercase. Now, if you're having a full stop and you're ending it with a full stop here, you can't then run into a dialogue tag because that's confusing. You are tired, full stop. She asked, full stop. That's odd. We're kind of expecting something else after that point if you've had a full stop there. So you'd use the comma like up here, but just keep a note that maybe an exclamation mark or a question mark in this case, it acts like a comma for the capitalization rules. It's a little trick there. Now, if your sentence is a separate action to speech, so if it's not a dialogue tag, for example, then you want to start a new sentence. So, been up late. He sat down on the couch, yawning. Those are two separate sentences. Been up late, comma, he sat down on the couch. Doesn't make sense because we're expecting, as a reader, we're expecting a dialogue tag there to indicate what we're doing. So if it's a new sentence or a separate action to the speech, you need to have a full stop or the other punctuation and then start a new sentence to make sure that it's really clear exactly what's happening. This is all about clarity. Be as clear as you can for your reader so they're able to follow the story. Don't confuse them by missing some of this stuff. Okay, making it interesting. Remember that each character has a different goal in the conversation. Dialogue is more interesting when characters have different or opposing goals. So sometimes you need to do some exposition and so you just have characters explaining things to each other. But otherwise, it's more interesting if they're coming at things from slightly different angles, or they're having disagreements, or they're asking questions and working things out together. And conversation should always have a clear purpose. Could be tense, fun, mysterious. Minimize exposition if you can. Sometimes exposition is necessary and you need it, and it's better to do it through dialogue. But Try to avoid those back and forth question answer things that don't really go anywhere. You get stuck in this loop of them talking about their day or something, and it doesn't really build to anything. It doesn't create character. It doesn't, we don't enjoy it. It's just blah. Try to avoid those kind of conversations and just skip them entirely. Also, conversations that are just constantly oppositional. Where are you going? I'm going here. Why? Because I need to. That's not a good reason. Yes, it is. No, it's not. That kind of, where it goes back and forth constantly, that can get really, really dull if that goes on for a while. So keep it snappy. Now, try to avoid overly expository dialogue. So this is the classic example where they say, thank you for coming. As you know, 49 days ago, we launched a ship off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. It all started when we began our mission to find the lost ark. This is where they're kind of trying to info dump, but there might be a better way to do that than really long expository dialogue that gets a bit dry and a bit tedious. Sometimes you can't avoid exposition, but minimize it wherever possible and show it rather than tell us as much as you can. There is a balance between showing and telling. You don't want to do too much of one or too much of the other, but just get that dance right between those two things. Okay, avoid descriptive dialogue disease. It's really, really easy to overwrite dialogue. This is where we have something like this. The trouble is, she sighed, I just don't know who to trust. You can trust me, he reassured. I can't, she exclaimed. Of course you can, he whispered quietly. Not after what you did, she accused. You can hear it when I'm reading it out. It's clunky, isn't it? You kind of stumble over it. And we're spending so much time processing all these different ways that they're saying it that we kind of start to lose the meaning of the dialogue. It's too much. Sometimes in kind of early writing, where students are encouraged to use all these dialogue tags and don't just have he said, she said. He said, she said is fine. And in fact, a lot of the time it's better because it's invisible to the reader. We don't really notice it. Now you want to avoid that, like just constantly he said, she said, back and forth. But you can break that up with other things like action or description of how they're saying something. So here's another version. The trouble is, she sighed, I just don't know who to trust. You can trust me, he said. I can't. Now, we don't have a dialogue tag here, but it's really, there's only two people in the conversation. So it's really clear who's talking. Of course you can. John put one hand gently on her shoulder. So instead of John said reassuredly, we're giving a reassuring action that communicates the tone. It avoids that clunky kind of dialogue tags. Not after what you did. Now, we don't need to say she exclaimed or she shouted because there's an exclamation mark there. An exclamation mark is indicating she's exclaiming. That's why it's called an exclamation mark. So instead, we have some action that places and gives a bit more context to show us how angry she is. Karen slapped his hand away, storming into the kitchen and slamming cupboards. We're getting that sense of what she's doing, and that's helping us to frame the dialogue. So this is much, much better than the previous version, which was just really clunky and full of heavy adverbs that are talking about the dialogue. Avoiding repetitive questioning. This is a trap that is really easy to get into, and it starts to feel a bit dry and a bit slow. I started talking about it a little bit before. Here's an example. Where have you been, she asked. Out. He wandered over to the lounge. What exactly does that mean? None of your business. Brian switched on the television. Is that perfume I can smell on you? It's probably yours. Flicking through a few channels, Brian settled on Family Feud. It seemed appropriate. Are you cheating on me? She threw a pillow to his head, knocking over his drink and shattering the glass. Now, this isn't great, and there's a few reasons for it. One is that our dialogue here is not correct, so that needs to be a separate sentence, doesn't it? But also, this back and forth question answer is getting a little bit tired, and actually in some ways is lowering the tension in the conversation. This should be a really tense conversation. And simply by changing all of these questions to statements, it changes the conversation and it makes it much more tense. So let's have a look at the example here. You're late, she said. Been out. He wandered over to the lounge. Out. Yes, I know exactly what out means. Mind your own business. Brian switched on the television. I can smell perfume on you. It's probably yours. Flicking through a few channels, Brian settled on Family Feud. It seemed appropriate. You're a filthy cheater, Brian. She threw a pillow at his head, knocking over his drink and shattering the glass. Just by changing the questions to statements to accusations, we've changed the tone and we've ratcheted up the tension. So if, there's a little trick, if you're finding you're getting lots of repetitive questions, try turning them into statements because it will often amp up how tense the story is in that point. So let's leave that there. Go forth, format dialogue correctly, make dialogue interesting, use dialogue tags, but sparingly and just enough to keep the message and keep the communication clear. Get someone else to read it and check over to see if they're losing track of where people are and who's talking. One final tip is probably try to avoid having more than 3 or so people having a conversation, 4 at the absolute max, because it gets quite difficult to write those scenes. I try to break characters up into groups just to keep them together. Otherwise you forget about Robert, the 7th character, who's been standing there staring into space for the last 8 minutes while the other characters have been talking, and you kind of forget he was there. So try and keep them tight. Go write interesting dialogue.